On March 16, 1948, Billie Holiday walked out of Alderson Federal Prison Camp believing that her sentence was over. But New York police had already taken away the cabaret card she needed to sing in the city's nightclubs, and they would not give it back. She was free to return home, but many of the stages that had built her career were now legally closed to her. The voice was intact. The machinery around it had been methodically dismantled. She had no manager. Joe Glazer, who had handled her career for years, had quietly stepped back before the trial was even over. The kind of loyalty that reveals itself fully only when tested. She had no recording contract. Decca had let her go. She had no nightclub bookings, no guaranteed income, no apartment she could call her own. What she had was the voice, which had, if anything, deepened in the year she'd spent away from stages and microphones. Before anything else can be understood about what happened to Billie Holiday after Alderson, one fact has to be established. It is not a glamorous fact. It doesn't appear in most biographies more than briefly, because it is administrative and procedural and therefore resistant to narrative drama. But it is the hinge on which the whole story turns. New York City, for much of the 20th century, required anyone who wanted to perform in a venue that served alcohol to carry a document issued by the police department. It was called a cabaret card. Formally, it was a work permit. In practice, it was something closer to a permission slip, the city's way of deciding who was and who was not allowed to stand in front of a microphone in a bar or nightclub within the 5 boroughs. The system had grown up out of Prohibition-era anxieties and never quite gone away once Prohibition ended. The legal apparatus worked roughly like this. Establishments serving alcohol operated under licenses issued by the state liquor authority. The city added its own layer, a cabaret license for any venue offering entertainment alongside alcohol. And then, below that, came the individual requirement. Every employee who might come into contact with the public in a licensed cabaret had to apply for their own personal card from the NYPD. Performers, bartenders, servers, coat check attendants, in some interpretations, all of them needed the card to work legally. The application process involved a background check, and the background check involved criminal records. A conviction on a narcotics charge was, without exception, grounds for denial. There was no formal appeals process worth speaking of. There was no sunset provision that made old convictions irrelevant after some period of demonstrated rehabilitation. There was no board that weighed the severity of a past offense against the circumstances of the present application. There was a record and there was a stamp, and if the record showed what the police were looking for, the stamp did not come down. And without the stamp, you could not work. This is what awaited Billie Holiday on the other side of the prison gate. She had been convicted on a narcotics charge. The conviction was on her record. The record meant no cabaret card. No cabaret card meant no nightclub work in New York City. She was 32 years old, and the city where she had made her name had quietly, without announcement and without apology, closed its doors to her. To understand what that denial actually cost her, you have to understand what New York nightclubs were in 1948. Not sentimentally, but economically and professionally. Jazz was not, in the late 1940s, primarily a recording industry. It was a live performance industry. Records existed, records sold, records mattered. But the income that sustained musicians came from the clubs. A residency at a major room meant steady money week after week, with the possibility of recordings and radio broadcasts emerging from that visibility. The clubs were the ecosystem. Without them, a musician could exist on the margins, occasional concert dates, touring in smaller cities, one-off engagements here and there. But the center of the industry, the place where careers were built and sustained and renegotiated, was New York. And within New York, almost every room that mattered served alcohol. Almost every room that mattered required a cabaret card for its performers. She could sing in concert halls. Carnegie Hall did not operate under the same licensing classification as a nightclub, and the specific provision did not apply in the same way. She could go on the road, and she did extensively because she had no choice and because roadwork paid. She could perform in other cities, other countries, other contexts where the NYPD's administrative machinery had no jurisdiction. But New York was where she lived, where her musical community was, where the press was concentrated, where the record labels had their offices, where the whole infrastructure of her career had been built. Performing in New York on a concert stage once or twice a year was not the same as being able to work steadily in New York's clubs, night after night, the way a working musician works. 11 months after walking out of Alderson, she performed at Carnegie Hall. The concert was produced by Ernie Anderson, who understood the situation with sufficient clarity to book the right room. The question was whether anyone would come, whether the arrest and the conviction and the year away had damaged her public standing beyond repair, or whether the audience that had loved her before 1947 still existed and still wanted to see her. The answer came immediately. The house was full. Standing room was taken. People came who had no tickets and waited outside hoping for a returned one. The reviews that ran the next day were not the careful, hedging reviews of critics watching a comeback attempt with cautious sympathy. They were the reviews of people who had witnessed something extraordinary and were trying to find language adequate to it. She sang Strange Fruit that night. She sang the ballads she had made her own over the preceding decade, songs that had emerged directly from her own experience and bore the marks of that experience in every phrase. Her voice had changed. Everyone who heard her in those years noted the change. The instrument was darker now, the range slightly narrower at the top. The control over phrasing and silence and the exact placement of a note within a beat more complete than it had ever been. Whatever the year at Alderson had cost her personally, it had not cost her this. She walked off stage to a sustained ovation. The audience did not want her to leave. By every measure that a performance can be measured by, she had demonstrated that she was at the height of her powers. She still could not get a cabaret card. It is worth being precise about what the cabaret card system was and was not, because it is easy to tell this story in a way that makes it seem exceptional. A special persecution directed at one woman because of her fame, or her race, or her perceived political associations. All of those things were real factors in how her case unfolded. But the system itself was not exceptional. It was the ordinary operation of a routine municipal apparatus, and that ordinariness is part of what makes it worth examining closely. The card requirement affected thousands of musicians who were not famous. A drug conviction, a morals charge, an arrest that had led nowhere legally but had nonetheless left a mark on a record. Any of these could deprive a working musician of the ability to earn a living in the city's clubs. The enforcement was not always consistent, and it was subject to the discretion of individual officers and supervisors in ways that created their own inequities. But the basic machinery was real, and its effects on working musicians who never made the papers were as devastating as its effect on Billie Holiday, with the difference that nobody wrote about them. Holiday's case became visible precisely because she was famous. Her arrest in 1947 had been heavily covered. Her Carnegie Hall triumph was heavily covered. The contrast between the full house cheering her at Carnegie Hall and the police department's refusal to let her work in a nightclub was vivid enough that journalists noticed it and wrote about it. What the coverage revealed, though rarely stated in these terms, was the extent to which the cabaret card system functioned not as a public safety measure, but as a permanent punishment layered on top of whatever sentence the courts had already imposed. She had been convicted of a narcotics offense. She had served her time. In the standard theory of the criminal justice system, that time served was the penalty, after which the person was to be reintegrated into society. The cabaret card said, not quite. The cabaret card said, The penalty the courts imposed is finished, but our penalty is not subject to that same clock. Our penalty is indefinite. She applied for the card. The application was denied. She applied again. The application was denied again. Each denial arrived with the same bureaucratic flatness, the same absence of explanation beyond the statutory one. Her lawyers engaged the system on her behalf, writing letters, requesting hearings, making the argument that a woman who had clearly demonstrated her ability to perform and her commitment to doing so deserved the opportunity to work in her chosen field in her own city. The department listened with the particular quality of attention that bureaucracies bring to arguments they have already decided not to act on. She worked anyway. The road offered what New York withheld. Venues in other cities operated under different local rules, and the NYPD's stamp was not required in Philadelphia or Chicago or Los Angeles or any of the dozens of other places where jazz clubs operated under their own licensing regimes. She played theaters. She performed at concerts, at benefits, at private events. She kept working because she had no alternative, and because stopping was not something she was constitutionally capable of for long. She recorded. Columbia had released a collection of her earlier work, produced by John Hammond, and those records had introduced her to a new generation of listeners who had not been old enough to see her perform in the clubs during the years when she was a regular working presence on 52nd Street. The loss of the Decca contract was painful, but she eventually found other labels willing to work with her, and the recordings from the late 40s and early 50s captured her voice in its later transformation. The reduced range, the deepened expressiveness, the quality that critics started reaching for unusual words to describe, settling variously on wounded, survived, earned. In 1952, she signed with Norman Granz, whose label would eventually become Verve. Granz had spent years booking integrated concerts at a time when that was neither commercially obvious nor personally safe, and he recorded the musicians he thought were important without excessive interference. He understood that Billie Holiday was still one of the most significant voices in American music, regardless of what the New York Police Department thought about her paperwork. The recordings she made for Granz between 1952 and 1957 are among the documents by which she is best known today. They were made, every one of them, while she was officially prohibited from holding a job in a New York nightclub. It would be a simplification to say that her troubles with American law enforcement began and ended with the narcotics charge filed in 1947. The charge was real, and the addiction it named was real. But the context in which that charge was filed, the particular target she had been made, the particular persistence with which authorities pursued her, exists against a background that requires examination. Harry Anslinger was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from its founding in 1930 until 1962, a tenure of 32 years during which he shaped American drug policy with a combination of genuine conviction and unmistakable racial hostility. His files contain his views on Black Americans expressed in language that requires no softening to convey its character. He believed, with the institutional authority of a federal bureau behind him, that jazz music was a corrupting influence and that its practitioners represented a social problem worth pursuing aggressively. Holiday had come to his attention years before her 1947 arrest, and the reason was not primarily her drug use. The reason was a song. Strange Fruit was written by Abel Mirapol, a schoolteacher from the Bronx who published under a pseudonym, and it described the lynching of black men in the American South with an unflinching directness that made many white audiences deeply uncomfortable and made certain officials more than uncomfortable. It made them attentive. Holiday began performing it in 1939 and continued performing it for the rest of her career. She sang it, by her own description, as a way of doing something with the rage and grief she carried about the conditions of black life in the country where she lived. She performed it quietly, devastatingly, with the lights lowered and a single spot on her face, and she did not take requests for encores. The song made her a target, not through any single act of official retaliation, but across years. As Anslinger's bureau looked for points of leverage against musicians it considered troublesome, and found in the overlap of jazz culture and narcotics use the tools it needed. The 1947 operation against her involved a federal agent named Jimmy Fletcher, who was assigned to befriend her, gain her trust, and document evidence of drug use, the kind of investigation that, under other circumstances, would have been reserved for figures of considerably more consequence to public safety than a jazz singer. Fletcher, by his own account given late in his life, grew to like her and found the operation troubling. He testified against her anyway. She was convicted, she served the year, and she came home to the cabaret card denial. Whether the denial was coordinated with Anslinger's bureau or arrived independently through the ordinary operation of the NYPD's licensing system is a question the historical record does not answer cleanly. What is clear is that it served, by coincidence or design, exactly the purpose that federal pressure had been trying to serve through other means. It kept her from working in New York. It imposed a sustained economic cost, and it lasted 9 years. In 1956, nearly a decade after she had walked out of Alderson, and 9 years after the Carnegie Hall concert that had demonstrated beyond any reasonable argument that she remained one of the most consequential performers of her era, the New York City Police Department issued Billie Holiday a cabaret card. The granting of the card was not accompanied by any statement of regret for the years of denial. There was no acknowledgement that the system had functioned as a second sentence imposed without trial. There was no recognition that the people enforcing this policy had perhaps applied it with particular consistency in the case of a black woman who had been publicly identified with a song about lynching and who had declined to make herself smaller or quieter in response to official pressure. There was a card. After 9 years, there was simply a card. She worked. Reviews were enthusiastic. She was Billie Holiday, and she sang like Billie Holiday. And the people who came to hear her responded the way they always had. But the card had arrived late enough that the years of steady New York club work it might have sustained were largely behind her. The body had been carrying the accumulated cost of everything that had been done to it and everything she had done to it herself. And by 1956, those costs were becoming visible in ways they had not been a decade earlier. The recordings she made in her final years have generated decades of interpretive disagreement. They are cited as evidence of decline. The voice technically diminished, the range further narrowed, the pitch not always where it once arrived automatically. They are cited equally as evidence of something else entirely. An expressive depth that only becomes possible when technical ease is no longer available as a crutch, when the singer has nothing left but intention, and the listener has nowhere to hide from it. Both readings are defensible. Both are probably partial. What is not in dispute is that audiences continued to come, that she continued to move them, and that the connection between her voice and the people listening to it remained as direct and unmediated as it had ever been. She died on July 17, 1959, at Metropolitan Hospital in New York. She was 44 years old. A federal narcotics agent had been stationed outside her hospital room in her final weeks, investigating reports that she had been using heroin while hospitalized. An investigation that speaks for itself about the persistence of official attention to a woman who had been sick for 30 years and was now dying. She had $750 in small bills taped to her leg and 70 cents in her bank account. She had spent the last decade of her performing life navigating a system designed to make her navigation as difficult as possible. And she had navigated it anyway. Recording albums that are still listened to, performing concerts that are still talked about by people who were there, leaving behind a body of work that has not diminished with time. the cabaret card system was abolished in New York City in 1967. The city offered no formal acknowledgement of the musicians it had damaged through the decades of its operation. The license requirement simply ended, as bureaucratic instruments often do, not through any reckoning with what they had cost, but through the quiet accumulation of pressure and the eventual recognition that the thing was indefensible. Thelonious Monk had lost his card in 1951 and not regained it until 1957. Charlie Parker had lost his and spent years working around it. The list of musicians whose careers were bent or broken by the system is long and mostly unwritten, because most of them were not famous enough to generate the documentation that makes a historical record. What Billie Holiday's case makes visible is something the system was designed to keep invisible: that the official apparatus of criminal punishment does not always end at the prison gate. It extends into the licensing office, into the background check, into the form that requires a box to be checked, and the box that, once checked, forecloses options without explanation and without end. She had served her sentence. She had come home. She had proven, in front of full houses, that she could still do the thing she had spent her life learning to do. And the city looked at all of that and stamped her application denied, and stamped it again the next year, and the year after that, for 9 years running, until it finally, without ceremony, changed its mind. The voice she carried out of Alderson lasted longer than the system that tried to silence it. That is the only thing here that resembles justice, and it is a poor substitute for the actual kind.